Do you remember how earlier we were talking about self-confidence comes from that place where we talk to ourselves? So it's what we say to ourselves, right? And so what you say to yourself is based on something. It doesn't come from a vacuum. Thoughts, the perceptions that you have of yourself just don't pop into your brain and come out of nowhere. There's an old Latin word for creation called ex nihilo, means out of nothing. Well, guess what? The thoughts that pop into your head and become your language of what you tell yourself are not ex nihilo. They come from somewhere. And oftentimes where they come from is beliefs, both conscious and subconscious, that we have developed about ourselves, our self-perception, over the course of our lifetimes. And these things can come back and have a powerful influence on our inner dialogue. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Salty Pastor Podcast. I'm Dr. Douglas Peak, and I am your ever soft and sweet, beyond belief, salty pastor. Of course, I hope you hear the sarcasm statement. We're really glad that you're listening to this podcast, and our goal at the Salty Pastor Ministries is to coach you up in your faith. That means basically giving you the tools and techniques to think for yourself, clarify what you believe and why you believe it so that you have a firm foundation. One of the things that's happening in this world is that there is a cacophony. A cacophony, or you could say cornucopia of ideas, ideologies, beliefs, and competing values. And it's really difficult sometimes to just navigate all that stuff. You can get really confused and pulled in different directions. So the only way to be a candle lit in the darkness, salt of the earth, a city set on a hill, is if you have a rock solid foundation. This is the most important process, setting this foundation for any type of life that you want to live. And that's why we're talking about confidence this week. What is confidence? And on Tuesday's podcast, we talked about confidence can be something that you have in other people. There's a level of trust that you have in them. Trust is basically a predictability of behavior over a long period of time. We often step back and we look at that as character, right? It's just, wow, this person will always do this. What's interesting is a lot of times we don't know why people have predictability of behavior. Sometimes it can be motivated by nefarious reasons. Often it's motivated by altruistic reasons. And the reason why is because when it comes to confidence, we have to understand is that as human beings, we're not perfect, we're flawed, we have blind spots and idiosyncrasies. What happens is, as we talked about on Tuesday's podcast, is that confidence in other people, we can have it tainted by those things. You can also have confidence in God. And what's great about confidence in God is that the more you learn about God, the less your flaws and blind spots impact your confidence in God, which I think right there, that could be a series of podcasts, 10 long. That simple truth is that the more I know God, the more I am in Jesus, the less my own flaws, my own perceptions, my own idiosyncrasies influence my confidence in God. So I believe that's the meaning in 1 John, where he says that if our hearts condemn us, that's okay because God is greater than our hearts. And so I think it's really important to understand that truth. The last one was, of course, self-confidence. And self-confidence comes from what we tell ourselves, that internal beliefs that we have that we vocalize to ourselves all the time. And guess what? Our flaws, our idiosyncrasies, our failures and our mistakes and our blind spots will influence what we tell ourselves all the time. And that, of course, impacts our confidence, our self-confidence. So the whole point about this series on confidence is to help us understand where it comes from, what impact it has in my life, and how I can grow my confidence. And self-confidence is different than confidence in yourself, okay? And I want to really demarcate that as we talk about the practical implications of that today. And that is confidence in myself is a confidence that Paul talks about in Philippians chapter 3. He says, I, more than anybody else, can have confidence in the flesh. What he means by that is he's saying, here in this material world, I lived by its rules and I accomplished all this stuff. I was the best of the best at these various things. And he said, but that didn't give me a confidence in who I was and that I was at peace with God. He said, the only way I ever found self confidence, which is different than confidence in self, is that when I understood that I identify with Christ, with his death, burial, and resurrection, and that now my righteousness, meaning peace with God, comes from him and not from my own effort. So that's how you have self confidence as opposed to confidence in self. Okay. Now, uh, I learned how to fly a couple of years ago. I got my private pilot's license, and it was quite a journey. It was a lot of work. And one thing that I learned early on is that flying a plane is a learned skill, but how well you fly the plane has everything to do with your confidence. You see, if there's an old saying is that there are cocky pilots and there are old pilots, but there are no cocky old pilots. They say it another way: there are bold pilots and there are old pilots, but there are no bold old pilots. And the reason why is because you can't be cocky. You can't have confidence in yourself, but if you have self confidence, it makes a huge impact on your skill at flying a plane. So, what I learned from this process is how they actually increase your confidence. And what they do is they work on your competency and then they institute a checklist in order for you to be more competent. So it's really interesting how they build your confidence. And flying a plane has a lot to do with confidence. And I think the reason why so many people today struggle with self-confidence, not the confidence itself, but just self-confidence, a peace at with who they are, a peace that they know they're not perfect, but they're okay, and a security in who they are and where they're going through life. And I think people really struggle with that is because they are insecure, right? They're insecure. And insecurity comes from all different places. Insecurity can come from your family of origin when you grew up. Maybe you grew up in a family where there wasn't a lot of development, there wasn't a lot of training or coaching, either by intention or just by example. Maybe it was a toxic environment in your family of origin where one of your parents had an addiction issue and constantly said things. Maybe a parent that had a mental health issue. And so they didn't know how to affirm you as a child. And those things leave lasting marks. If you grew up in a single parent home, those things leave lasting marks. And that creates insecurity in who we are. And so it takes a long time to overcome those insecurities and become a self confident person. But one of the fastest and best ways to do it is receive a brand new identity from Christ and then walk and live in that identity. That's why young people, I think today, are turning to Jesus, not religion, not what they perceive as church, but just to Jesus, because they're seeing that he is the perfect father that helps them overcome all these insecurities that undermine their confidence. Now, another way in which people develop insecurity is that they're never expected to attain to a higher standard in their life when they were growing up. They were never had expectations clearly communicated to them, and then as children held accountable for achieving those expectations. Now, the reason why this is such a critical part is because what research says today is that kids who grow up in homes with high structure, high expectations for behavior and performance, and high love, meaning they also felt valued and affirmed. Those are the healthiest adults in the world. Now, if you take those away, it can be pretty toxic. For instance, if you have a highly structured home and you have high expectations, but there's very little love, then that really is not good for adult mental health. If you have all love and no expectations, you raise very insecure young adults. So there's another place where insecurity comes from. So where can this confidence that we need and desire in our lives, how can we work on it and how can we develop it in our lives? And so we want to take a little bit of what we studied from the Bible on Tuesday and start applying it today. I want to talk about a story. A young man who grew up, went to university in the UK, and I think his parents or his grandparents immigrated to the UK when from India. And what happened is he grew up in their school system, had lots of friends. He went off to university. I can't remember if it was Oxford, Cambridge, but it was a Queen's College, something like that. It was a high ranked university there in the UK. And when he got out, though, he kind of decided to get in touch with his roots. And so he, at 22, left the UK to go back to India and be a monk. And so he was a monk for a couple of years, maybe 3 years. And then he decided that, you know what, the monk life is not for me. So then he left being a monk and he went back to the UK. And he said, at that point in my life, everything changed. I tried to get a job and I was turned down by 40 different companies. He said they would ask for my work experience, and I would say, well, my work experience is sitting still and being quiet. And he goes, that's not exactly the work experience they're looking for. So he had to move in with his parents, and he started to feel like a complete failure because all of his friends that he reconnected with had careers. They were 3 or 4 years ahead of him, and they were being promoted, and they were doing really well in their jobs, and he couldn't get a job. He says, I was turned down by over 40 different companies. And he said, as I look back, he said, I started to understand something. He said, up until that point, I felt I had lived a very fulfilling life. But now I moved home, tried to get a job and couldn't, and I felt like an absolute failure. He goes on to say, I was in a depression for 2 years. And he says, what's really interesting is looking back now, is he said, what put me in a depression and why I felt like a failure wasn't what I was doing when I was doing it. So when he was going to school, when he's at university, even when he was being a monk, he felt like he was living a very fulfilling life. Then he comes back to the UK and he can't get a job. So he started to look back over his life and reinterpret how he felt about it. I think that's a very significant point. He said, what I was doing is I was comparing myself to all of my university colleagues around me and that were now in the business world and doing well. And I decided to look back at my life choices and consider them a failure because they weren't helping me at this stage in my life. Therefore, it was what he felt about his decisions that destroyed his confidence. Did you catch that? It was what he felt about his decisions that destroyed his confidence. And guess what feelings do? They always change. So if we go back and reinterpret what's happened in our life and we use feelings to interpret that, guess where that ends up? It ends up in what we tell ourselves. And what we tell ourselves is what will determine whether or not we will have self-confidence. Not confidence in ourselves, but self-confidence. So what are some practical things that I think if you would really like to grow your confidence? Well, number one is remember that confidence always comes from competence. So the more you learn new things, the more you keep current on the things you know, the more you push yourself, train yourself, grow yourself, the more self-confident you will become. This is why Paul said in Philippians chapter 3, he said, look, one thing I do, I forget what lies behind. See, he doesn't go back and reinterpret with feelings what was in his past. He says, I forget what lies behind and I strain forward towards the upward call. He says, I want to reach out and grasp what's ahead. So, confidence in your life comes from your willingness to develop competency in straining forward into new things. I want to say that again. Confidence will grow when you develop the competence of learning new things, of pushing yourself forward. You're never going to be confident if you feel like you have to be a perfect person or possess all knowledge in some particular discipline or area, because that's never going to happen. When I was getting my doctorate of ministry degree, one of the things that I thought was really interesting in the program is they bring you into the program and they would say this all the time. They go, look, once you get your doctorate and you're hooded, that doesn't mean you know everything. The whole purpose of a PhD or a doctoral degree is simply this: you are learning how to learn. The whole point of this discipline and going this far in academia is so that you have humility, because now you know what you don't know. Most people go through life have no idea what they don't know. But the more you dig into academia, you get a PhD or you get a doctorate, the more you realize I don't know very much at all. But what you do learn is how to learn what you need to learn. And so that's why they bestow this degree upon you. It's called being hooded. And it's something that they put, on your head. You have a hood. They actually have it's like a collar piece, a sash that goes around the neck and down your back. And that's for your master's. And then on your head, you get this thing called a tam. And it's not a four-sided graduate degree. So it has multiple sides and it's a permanent thing. And the tassel is sewn permanently on one side. You can't move the tassel. And the thing about being hooded, tammed, is that you now have the designation that you're fully aware of what you don't know, but you also know how to go and learn it in the proper way with the most objective way possible. So this is all about competency. You see, it's all about helping you develop competency. So let's say right now you have really low self-confidence. What's the first thing that you could do? Well, the first thing I would suggest that you do is I would suggest that you start developing competency in what the Bible teaches you about God and how he perceives you. I would just start reading the New Testament. I'd read the book of Luke and then I'd read the book of Acts. I'd go back and I'd read the book of Luke and I'd read the book of Acts. And I would read it 5 or 6 times. It doesn't take very long to read these two books. But what happens is the more you read it, the more you will see the picture of who Jesus is and the picture of the early church. And what that does is it develops your competency in the scripture. Now, I know people that have memorized the New Testament. I know people who've memorized whole books. You don't have to do all that to have competency. But I do think you need to make yourself aware and familiar with the language, how it's written, and just the flow and the feel. And what happens is the more you read the New Testament, the more you're going to have a picture of what it means to know and walk with Jesus Christ. The second area that I would develop my competency in to build self-confidence is I would start spending more time doing the things that I know I'm good at so that I get to the point where I can start learning and doing things that I'm not so good at. And I think once you do that, your confidence will grow. The second thing that happens that really develops self-confidence is this whole notion of belief and whether or not you know what you believe and why you believe it. Do you remember how earlier we were talking about self-confidence comes from that place where we talk to ourselves? So it's what we say to ourselves, right? And so what you say to yourself is based on something. It doesn't come from a vacuum. Thoughts, the perceptions that you have of yourself just don't pop into your brain and come out of nowhere. There's an old Latin word for creation called ex nihilo, means out of nothing. Well, guess what? The thoughts that pop into your head and become your language of what you tell yourself are not ex nihilo. They come from somewhere. And oftentimes where they come from is beliefs, both conscious and subconscious, that we have developed about ourselves, our self perception over the course of our lifetimes. And these things can come back and have a powerful influence on our inner dialogue, that inner conversation that we have with ourselves. And so the best way to change that language, to change what you tell yourself, is to work on your core beliefs, right? And understand that it is by faith that I adopt the truth of these beliefs into my life. They're not true because I want them to be true. They're not true because somebody told them to me and I trust that person. They're not true because I tested them and they're working out for me, which may be true. What the reason I trust them and believe them is because God has said them. So it's something from completely outside yourself that's coming in and teaching, speaking, what I call revelation to you in your life. And that's really what you need. If you want your words that you tell yourself to change, you have to have a revelation of new belief. And this is why I believe Christianity has had such a powerful impact in the world today. And it's because what it does is it really challenges the core beliefs. It really challenges the uh, underlying things that you build the foundation of your life on. And so it has a lot to do with that. And that's why learning, clarifying, articulating what you believe and why you believe it is powerful. For instance, when I was in college, I went on a retreat, and the main speaker there decided, well, instead of just having a bunch of sessions where I talk at these people all the time, he said, what I'm going to do is I'm going to train you up and kind of how to defend your faith, right? And we're like, what? And so he broke everybody up, and he would say, he would do all these little different techniques. And he says, okay, I want one of you to have the position that God is real. I want the other one of you to argue that God is not real. And so you had to, even though you believe in God, you had to argue as to why he wasn't real. And then he would flip flop it. He did a lot of different things like that. And he said, okay, what we're going to do now is I'm going to time everybody. I'm going to give you a few minutes to write it out or get it in your head. He goes, but I want everybody to be able to tell me why you follow Jesus in less than 2 minutes. And I go, wow, that's going to be tough. Because what that did is that really disciplined you. Is, well, do I do it because I love my family? Do I do it because these are all my friends? It's my community. It's just how I perceive myself. And what happened is he just kept pushing this over and over and over again. And it really helped you clarify the foundational truth of why you're a follower of Christ, right? All of these other things and reasons may influence that and support it, but what is the foundational stone on which you stand? And that is your very core belief of why you follow Jesus. And so I think clarifying what you believe and why you believe it, going to this retreat with this speaker really helped for me chart the course of the rest of my life. Okay. Now I want to kind of dig into, in the time we have remaining, uh, where the world tries to develop your self confidence. Okay. One of the things that our world has done, and I think it was a good intent, but it's had dramatically bad outcomes. And that was in our school system, we decided that, well, self esteem, research proves, is connected to educational outcomes. So, what we're going to do is we're just going to help build self esteem. Now, what happened was the techniques to build self esteem were horrendously flawed. And so, because what it was is just became positive self-talk. And that is, well, if we tell everybody that they're awesome, it's going to be great. Then the second thing they did is they said, well, we're not going to have any competition anymore, because if kids don't compete, then they don't compare. Well, what is interesting is that even though they had research that showed self-esteem is directly connected to outcomes, educational outcomes, what they didn't have is any research on how you actually build self-esteem in kids. And so they implemented this prematurely. And what ended up happening is the way in which you develop self-esteem you have to take into account human nature, and that's something they hadn't done. And the reason why, in my opinion, that they didn't do that is because if you take into account human nature, what you're doing is you're coming up with a definition of what it means to be a human being. In our society at the time, they were trying to make everything secular. So they didn't want to start from that position, right? So they started down the road and it became a disaster because now kids grew up tremendously insecure because they don't feel competent in anything. And then they also grew up entitled, thinking that, well, I was always told I was right, so I must be right. And the reason why you don't think I'm right is something's wrong with you. And so we produced a generation of kids where the percent of kids that are like that is higher. All kids aren't like that. All adults aren't like that. But the percent of young people that are like that has increased dramatically. And so this became a concern. And the point I'm trying to make is simply this: confidence cannot come from positive self talk. You can't tell yourself something because deep down in your soul, you don't believe it yet, right? You just don't believe it yet. So it's a paper tiger, right? It looks like it's powerful, it looks like it works. It's just a paper tiger. It has no strength and it has no claws. Real self-confidence has to come from something outside of yourself, which bestows upon you a core belief of who you are and who you're becoming. And so when that happens, you start to look at success and failure through a different lens. You look at uh, suffering and you look at blessing through a different lens. And the lens you change from is this: is my value and my confidence, right? Is not dependent on things always going well for me. It's not dependent on what I am telling myself. My perspective changes to the point where my confidence is based on what I believe about God's revelation to me. And that can never be shaken, right? It can never be shaken. You see this often when people are facing suffering in America or across the globe. And even when they don't understand what's going on, even when they don't understand how bad things are, you always say things like, well, God has a plan. Now, non-believers hear this and they go, "Well, God's plan must be really bad, or your God needs a better planner because your life stinks." And what they don't understand is that they aren't getting the point. And the point is this: is that whether I live or die, whether I suffer or am blessed, in the end, I'm okay with Jesus. Because whether I live or whether I die, I'm a winner. Paul said it this way: I'm kind of torn. I'm torn. He says, half of me wants to stay here and keep doing the work to bless other people, and half of me wants to go to heaven and be with Jesus. And that's kind of the perspective that you start to get, which changes good times versus bad times. I think one of the things that we have to really kind of focus on is that if we want to be self confident people, we're not going to be self confident if we're trying to have confidence in ourselves. We can only have confidence in who we are based on what Jesus has done and is doing and will do in our life. And I believe if you can start developing a deeper competency around that, if you can develop a more clear belief around that and why that is true to you, then I think that that inner dialogue in your brain is going to start to change and you're going to see real fruit emanate out in your life and how you approach situations. So, I think it's good for us to kind of wrap up right there. If you're a regular listener of the Salty Pastor, this is kind of a great little two podcast series, the one on Tuesday and the one today, to share with your friends. Would you share with a friend or share with somebody and say, hey, I got this guy, the Salty Pastor. I listened to it and just wondered you might be interested in doing that. It's really helped me grow my faith. I would really appreciate it if you did that. Kind of just share it out there on this issue of confidence, because I think it can really help people who are seeking and searching. The other thing, too, is if you go to our YouTube channel, Salty Pastor, and like and subscribe, because we're getting that thing up. It's slowly growing, and we're trying to get it over 1,000 subscribers. And once we do that, it unlocks a bunch of stuff that helps you propagate and get your message out more easily. So if you'd help us out by doing that, greatly appreciate it. Also, go to our website, because you can look at all the old episodes of the Salty Pastor. You can look at everything that we've done. And we're also going to start organizing them based on these topics as we roll them out. So you can go back and search specific ones and share them if you like. We have just surpassed 60,000 downloads, I believe, of the Salty Pastor podcast. So it is growing and you're a part of it. Also on our website, you can donate directly to the Salty Pastor. So if you'd like to jump on board and see this grow, I would greatly appreciate it. God bless you. And remember, I just want you to always be thinking for yourself.